9 a.m. in Shanghai, Shenzhen, and here in Hong Kong, you're watching The China Show. I'm Yvonne Man with David Ingles.
Good morning. We're counting down to the open of markets in Greater China. Our top stories today, Asian stocks rebounding to start the week off. Investors taking cues from Friday's strong close on Wall Street. Tech in focus at the open after sinking into bear market territory.
Japanese stocks getting a lift from Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi's landslide election victory, giving her party a supermajority in parliament.
Plus, Thai markets in focus as well as its pro-establishment ruling party gets a fresh mandate, boosting hopes for a political stability after years of turmoil.
And I'm Min Min Lo in Hong Kong, where the High Court is set to sentence former media mogul Jimmy Lai. He could face life in prison. He is convicted of collusion and sedition under national security laws.
All right. What a week to really kind of talk about the big themes here today. We thought we were going to talk about this whole kind of tech rebound. That could easily have been our top story
or
here
silver.
today. Or silver. Gold's back to 5,000. But then again, we got to talk about Japan here this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the markets are really giving us something to talk about. Landslide victory. We're calling today's teams, to Yvonne's point, there two elections and a tech rally, a rebound today. So, as far as Japan is concerned, what does this allow Takaichi to do? And I think there's a distinction between the support levels that she's garnered against the party as well, and whether or not this landslide victory just allow, of course, a more sort of pro-stimulus stance on the economy. What does it mean for the BOJ, of course? And I think you're seeing that as far as the banks underperforming today. But we can get to that market reaction in
the policy implications, I think, is still, we need to lay out. Right? What is going to be her vision here for the economy? Now, given the fact that she really campaigned on this election on herself, right? This was in some ways a referendum of the premier and her personality, which really won. This unprecedented sort of showing when it comes to the LDP. So, is that going to be something about the economic side of things that we need to talk about as well? Even the politics, right? When it comes to the Constitution, which is something that even Shinzo Abe may not have had that sort of mandate to do during his time. So that's one thing to watch. But, when it comes to stocks, we certainly are seeing that bid here this morning. It's interesting, too, with the yen. We thought, a landslide victory would mean 160 for dollar yen. Yeah. We're still at 156 levels here right now.
Well, I think they came out as well shortly after they got a sense of what market reaction was going to be.
Yeah.
And initially started planted in the seed of investors' minds that they're still watching the big moves in the currency. In fact, we're now stronger on the Japanese currency. Apart from all of that, of course, the stars are aligning as it pertains to risk appetite, because you do have that. I think if you take Thailand and you take Japan, in context, it's really just stability for both. And I think you had that big drop on Thursday risk assets, massive rebound into the weekend. So we're feeling the tailwinds of all three when you think about it that way. So in fact, just have a look at Japan, and we'll talk about the tech story in a moment, because there's also a very big day we're seeing in South Korea today. By the way, earnings as well, right? Japan, DBS is coming online as well. So Nikkei's up 5%. That's going to come up on your screens very, very shortly. That's not a move you don't normally see. That's a 3 sigma move going into today. We talked about the underperformance of the banks, because in some ways this in some way handicap what the BOJ is able to do as far as raising interest rates are concerned. Machinery index up 4.3. Taiwan coming online. We talked about Korea, Singapore, and within Singapore, the DBS story coming up bottom of your screen. So very strong showing coming through as far as the Taiwan and Korea stories are concerned. Very briefly, let's have a look at other themes across these markets. We talked about the currency market. Sterling's coming up on your screens. Keir Starmer, of course, top 8, resigning over the weekend. Bitcoin not feeling the same punch that we're getting as far as silver and the bounce in gold prices are concerned. A50 futures, we talked about this. We did enter bear market terrain on HS Tech. Hang Seng Tech Index going into the close. It's looking like we'll be reversing most of the weakness going into the Monday session today.
Yep, for more on Takaichi's landslide win, let's bring in our team now. Our Asia Trade co-anchor Sherry An joins us from Tokyo. Also with us is our MLive executive editor Mark Cudmore. Sherry, I'll start with you. This is a stunning sort of turnout here when it came to a very snowy day in Japan as well. But tell us through what this landslide victory is going to mean now for the LDP party and Takaichi.
To your point, Yvonne, I was thinking the same thing because we had heavy snow yesterday. And I was wondering how many people would actually go out and vote. But Japanese media now saying that the turnout was slightly better than the previous lower house election back in 2024. And you mentioned how this election was a referendum on Takaichi herself. Yes, it was. She really made it look like it was a referendum on her leadership. And she's incredibly popular here in Japan. So she actually managed to take her ruling Liberal Democratic Party to have the best number of seats gained ever since the founding of the LDP back in 1955. We are now seeing her coalition winning more than 350 seats. What that means is that this is a super majority. What that means is that they can actually override a veto in the upper house. So this really putting her on par with iconic prime ministers of the past here in Japan, Junichiro Koizumi, and of course her mentor Shinzo Abe as well. What will this mean in terms of policy is the big question. We have seen her in the last few months take more restrictive immigration measures, a shift away from Japan's pacifist principles. So that has also been felt across markets, with some of those sectors rallying ahead of the vote.
Yeah, Sherry, talk a little bit more specifically around what policy she could now push through with, I guess, less friction this time around.
I think the biggest question right now is what happens to the consumption tax suspension on food that she wanted for about 2 years during the campaign period. In fact, a lot of other politicians wanted this. For example, her main opposition, the Centrist Reform Alliance, wanted this consumption tax to be halted indefinitely. So this will be a key question on how she manages to pass this consumption tax halt on food and how long this will last for. Of course, this has led to a lot of questions about Japan's fiscal sustainability, because remember, this could cost, according to calculations, 5 trillion yen. That's more than $31 billion per year when you suspend this tax on food. We're also going to be watching very closely what happens to, of course, the constitutional revisions that could be put back on the table. Prime Minister Takaichi has advocated changing Article 9 in Japan's pacifist constitution to explicitly allow the country to maintain military forces. Remember, technically, Japan is not allowed to do that since World War II, although we do have the self-defense forces that act as a modern military here in Japan. But what this will mean also for the defense sector, for more defense spending, and of course, geopolitical influence here across the region at a time when Japan continues to see heightened tensions against China on Prime Minister Takaichi's comments around Taiwan just last year. This will be in focus in the months ahead.
Sherry, thank you, Sherry on. And there, we're going to bring in Mark Cudmore. Mark, it seems right now stocks are a bit up. Yen's actually strengthening, which is interesting, but JGB yields are ticking higher this morning. Does this Takaichi trade live on for a bit more?
I think the Takaichi trade is sustainable very long term. I think it's going to be, we're going to have a couple of years out of this. And that is, it's good for the Japanese economy relative to the stagnant place it's been for the last 30 years. So it is in a relative basis. The yen will continue to weaken as it has for the last 5 or 6 years. Remember, shouldn't just see it through the dollar yen lens, because obviously there's a separate dollar trade that quite often dominates. But the yen will continue to weaken on crosses. And yields will continue to go higher in JGBs. Why is that not working short term? Well, it's the classic dynamic we're seeing across assets at the moment this year, in that traders versus investors dynamic. And what I mean by that is that many of the established trends for the last few months are very sustainable fundamentally on a long term. But the real flows, what I call investors, the real structural flows behind those trends, move in the basis of years. And therefore, what's happened is short-term momentum traders, retail traders have got overexcited in some of these trends, which means some of them get overpriced in the short term, even though they're sustainable. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the Japan trade at the moment. That, the Takaichi trade has been very well placed, very well, priced. And in fact, many of the dynamics were there before there was even the new election announced, before she came into the running. It's about this idea of monetizing Japan's debt pile to boost the stock prices. And that's been the theme for the last year or so. So it's very, very well priced, which means it makes it very hard to kind of, how do you trade that long-term trend? What it really means is you're going to get disruption over the year ahead, but ultimately that disruption will be a chance for long-term structural flows to get behind those sustainable trends of higher Japanese equity prices, weaker yen, and higher JGB yields.
Mark, Your thoughts on the broader risk rally we're seeing today? I mean, certainly Japan is helping the benchmark, but we're also getting quite some big moves in Taiwan and Korea as far as the equity markets are concerned, of course.
Yeah. I'm quite worried about this week. I think that the last week or two has been a kind of rotation trade. Again, it's been the retail sector that's been hurt. It goes into this dynamic I've just been talking about, traders versus investors. Look, the structural backdrop for this year is wonderfully positive for equities. We've got fiscal expansion everywhere. We've got relatively good growth. We've got easy monetary policy coming from the Fed as the most important central bank. And we're clearly in the inflationary stage of the AI capex bubble. So everything is very positive for equity prices. The problem is we've massively priced all those dynamics short term, which is again why traders are getting hurt. And I think that for the next week or two, we see that pain that we see in the retail sector transition into the professional space, and we see more broad risk aversion. As I said, I think it'll be temporary. I think overall this year will be good, but I do think this week will be difficult. And I think that yes, we've seen some very powerful rallies in some assets. Things like silver and Bitcoin is probably the most extreme example, but those are broken markets. You see the most powerful short-term rallies in bear markets, and I think that that kind of shows that the liquidity is going. It's problematic. This week, the dynamic will probably be higher yields, and it'll be those higher yields that will set off another wave of risk aversion. So I'm a little bit worried about this week that it could be quite a tough week for traders.
It was already a tough week for Chinese tech last week, Mark. Could that reverse this week? Just going into your early thoughts on Chinese markets this Monday.
I think, unfortunately, people are worried about the AI space, and I think that the tech space. And as you say, China tech's been struggling for a while. I'm not seeing that kind of rebound imminently. Again, I'm very positive longer term, but I just think short term the dynamic stays quite heavy. So yeah, look, I think China, Hong Kong will be caught up in that general slightly tougher week, that more risk aversion week, where it's going from a rotation trade into just broader de-risking. And I think that's the dynamic we're going to have at the moment. This is not about a panic monger call for a longer term bear market. It's just that this week will likely be negative.
Mark, thank you. Mark Hudson there, our executive editor out of MLive in Singapore for us. More in a moment on the Japanese elections, the broader fiscal, monetary, and political implications there. The Hudson Institute's William Chou will be joining us to look at those things in a moment. A more assertive Japan coming under this Takaichi supermajority. We'll also get to the latest on the election in Thailand. Bloomberg Insight anchor Ingles and Yvonne Man has been in Bangkok for us.
And Vaughn, preliminary results here show Thailand's ruling Conservative Party is set to triple its number of seats in the House of Representatives. It is a resounding victory for Prime Minister Anutin Chanvirakul and marks the first win for a party aligned with the royalist establishment. Later, I'll be speaking with the head of the Thai Stock Exchange to discuss the outcome and how it could impact sentiment among investors hungry for stability. That conversation and more coming right up. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.
Right, we are set to open not just higher, much higher, as you can see on futures. We're better by about 1% on both contracts in Singapore and also here in Hong Kong. We should be getting the fix of the day coming out soon. We'll talk more about it in a moment. The big market story, of course, is really early this week over in Japan, and you'll see why shortly with the Nikkei 5%. There we go. Topics is about 2.5% to the upside, and a stronger currency at that, or despite a stronger currency in Japan. Of course, we're just continuing to unpack the election results over the weekend in Japan there.
Yeah, certainly that's one thing to watch where, the dollar-yen trade goes. I think most are thinking a majority in terms of this landslide victory could send dollar-yen to 160. We haven't seen that quite yet. Just now. Joining us now from D.C. is William Chou, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Hudson Institute's Japan Chair. William, it's great to have you back on the program. We talked about this election was really a referendum on Takaichi herself and her personality. Now that she has secured this massive mandate, how is she going to lay out the vision now?
Prime Minister Takaichi, I think, as you point out, it has been a sort of a personal mandate for her. I think she won on the basis of her popularity, her relatability, her policy communication, and her firmness on foreign policy issues. In terms of direction, I think this provides an opportunity for her to really implement her economic and security policies, which are really designed towards long-term sustainability for Japan, towards economic growth, as well as security policies that respond to the changing geopolitical realities of the region. So I think this is a long-term play for her.
And William, why does it matter if it was a bigger win for her? It was a big win for the party, clearly, but why does it matter if it was largely tied to her and not the party? What does that tell us about broader implications moving forward?
Yeah, so I think for her, I mean, look, she's always been popular, right? She's always had support of the LDP party base. The LDP itself is a big tent party, right? And so you have many different kinds of wings within the party. The former Prime Minister Ishiba is generally seen as from the left wing of the party. So I think one of the challenges that the LDP has faced since the passing of former Prime Minister Abe was essentially a question of where is it going to go? And I think Takaichi's resounding victory, where she polled, I think, 20 to 30% higher than the LDP party itself, gives the party a clear direction of what the voters want and how they are resonating with her economic and security policy vision. And it gives the party a clear path of sort of like, these are the things that we need to implement to push ahead for Japan long term.
A lot of fiscal sustainability questions. I mean, how do you think she's going to address them, given the fact that she's laid out that she wants to cut, food taxes and the like here? What is going to be the sort of message she sends to the bond market, for example?
Yeah, I think what for her, it's from her perspective, I think what she would probably argue is that this is a chance for her to really address sort of the structural challenges that you face within the Japanese economy, right? Things like demographic issues as well as sort of challenges towards economic growth. She's committing fully into this the 17 strategic sectors of economic investment, and which is aimed at building Japanese economic growth and resiliency. This is likely to continue to put a lot of pressure on bond markets and also currency issues. That said, she has said that she will try to ensure that all the stimulus is done responsibly. We are yet to see how that will play out. But I think what you are likely to see is some pressure on the bond markets and also softening of the currency, although that seems like that does not seem to be the case right now in terms of the dollar-yen trade. But I think what the takeaway there is also the fact that her very large supermajority victory ensures that there's at least stability and consistency in her economic policy going forward, and you're not going to see these constant wavering policies.
William, a more assertive Japan, now that she has a stronger mandate, how does that show up in terms of foreign policy, particularly with China?
Sure. So I wouldn't necessarily say that she is going to, like, her victory means a more assertive Japan. I think it will create a more decisive Japan, right? I think in terms of China, I think what this means is that I think China's effort to sort of their gambit to essentially weaken her by creating controversy over her remarks over Taiwan failed, right? It backfired into a lot of the popularity that drove her electoral victory. I think one thing that is important to know is that even though China has escalated since the November comments with economic measures against Japan, Takaichi she has not backed down, but she also has not escalated the situation. And so I think China is a country that respects strength. Her clear political strength back at home and likely strong partnership with her strong partnership with the United States means that, frankly, going forward, I expect the sort of the issue over Taiwan, her remarks over Taiwan, to actually de-escalate over time, just because I think China's earlier efforts to weaken her have backfired, and I think what you're likely to see is a avenue towards de-escalation going forward, at least in terms of U.S. and in terms of Japan and China.
Do you think she would actually even attempt to, in any way, to change the constitution then? Because that would be extremely unpopular with Beijing as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's hard to say. I will note that even though she has a supermajority in the lower house, they do not. Her party and her coalition partners do not have a supermajority in the upper house, and the next set of upper house elections will not take place until 2028. So, any constitutional revision will have to go through both houses. I think, given the scale of a magnitude of challenges that she faces, both in economic terms as well as security terms, my expectation is that she will be focused on those problems right now, and she will not be focused on the constitutional issues right now. Just because I think there's just too much work to do back in Japan on economics and security. And as we know, the Prime Minister does enjoy work.
Yeah, at least someone does. Not me. Anyway, well, William, speaking of, thank you for joining us on your Sunday. I'm kidding, of course, to my bosses. William Chou, their senior fellow. I work hard, right, Yvonne? Deputy Director of Hudson Institute's Japan. Right, 1.6%, 27,000. We're close to that on the Hang Seng Index. There is one trading debut to tell you about, at least at this point in time. Your Montage Tech, 168. The offering price was just under 107, 107, 106.89. So it's up substantially, suffice to say. More on that, plus a preview of the trading session ahead. This is the China Show.
Your agenda here today, obviously we've been tracking this rebound when it comes to tech across the region and globally here. So now that we have seen officially HS Tech enter a bear market last week, what does that mean for, of course, the AI trade in China? Sectors include crypto, metals, and miners, most of which have recovered here in the last couple of hours or so. So certainly one to watch whether this rebound goes cross-asset as well. In terms of Kuaishou, we're also watching that stock in particular here. There's also this ban on an unapproved yuan-linked stablecoin issuance. We'll flesh that out a little bit on what this means for the crypto space here. But there was also a fine when it came to Kuaishou. But there's a Montage Tech debut. Jimmy Lai sentencing that will be happening in the next hour as well. Of course, we're still waiting for some credit data, Dave.
Yeah, lots to watch, quite literally, when you look at the agenda today. And I think one of the initial things we'll be tracking is how long we remain in bear market on the Hang Seng Tech, given the bounce we're seeing already. In fact, the chart's coming up on your screen. So we have that up. Anyway, we are seeing a bounce today. We did enter bear market at the close on Friday, but with a 2% bounce, it does seem, of course, we'll be putting that behind us for now. There we go on your screens. It's that yellow line. It's the green line, and you see on your screens we were down 20% from the October 2 low. The opening bell is coming up next. A rally this Monday is upon us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. We're counting down to the Monday open here, Greater China. As you can see, I think it's worth pointing out that as we looked at weakness on price going into the weekend, we did substantially get a lot more inflows coming through from the mainland across the Stock Connect. So 3 days of very strong southbound flows into Hong Kong. Perhaps we are getting a bounce today after we did enter bear market terrain on the Hang Seng Tech Index specifically, Yvonne.
Yeah, is this enough to kind of lead to some dip buying? Certainly that's one thing to watch here, but that U.S. session on Friday and that tech rebound certainly is lifting most of the region here today. So even Korea, Taiwan are recovering quite well here. And of course, Japan doing its own thing after that landslide victory with Takaichi over the weekend. So certainly there's plenty of, I guess, good news right now. We'll see if this lasts, right? As Mark Cutmore says, he's worried about this week, whether this is more a rotation or more now a de-risking sort of thing that traders are looking at here today. Could still be some choppy waters in terms of the trading environment for the next few days as well to kind of wash out these key themes here. But right now we are still seeing onshore markets doing quite well at the open. We're up about 1% for the CSI 300, inching around that 4,700 level here once again. And we're watching, of course, what goes on in Shenzhen. Continue to see upside there about 1.3%. You're seeing recovery in some of the metal space as well. So copper is up some 2% here. Steel and iron ore still in negative territory. The Shanghai crude is catching a slight bid. We'll see how gold, we'll see how silver does here. But yes, gold going back to 5,000 is certainly a good psychological sort of milestone as well to watch out for, just given the whipsaw we've been seeing across precious metals of late. Not much movement here in terms of some of the large caps here, except for the likes of Capricorn Tech, which we've seen kind of local chip stocks really kind of be weighed down by a lot of the NVIDIA sort of news of late. So certainly now we're seeing a bit of upside there for Capricorn. We're up some 2%. Let's see how Hong Kong fares here as well. There was some fines declines across some of the tech space. We'll get you through that. But right now we are seeing a sea of green in Hong Kong. HS Tech, there you go. We're up some 2% after, of course, we finally entered into that technical bear market here. So looks like there is a bit of people coming back into this market here. MSCI China, though, mind you, we're still lower by about 0.9%, which is interesting to see here, the dichotomy that we're seeing across that. But yes, property is still catching a bit here this morning. We're still trading on 693 for the currency, but most of the tech space is looking pretty good, right? So Baidu, Alibaba is up some 3% or more. HSBC continues to be an up arrow story. We're up close to 3% for there. So that's really lifting the financial space here once again. Let's hit the boards and talk a little bit more about Kuaishou. Let's talk a little bit more about Ningbo. So this was a fine that the company had to go through here, given that they had some misleading information when it came to that deal with CATL. So right now the stock is up some close to 10%. We're also watching Kuaishou here. So the government did slap a fine on the company here when it came to pornographic content on the platform. The city came out saying, look, the amount of money that they're being fined, it doesn't seem like it's that big of a threat to their earnings, to the whole live streaming or e-commerce business. They say for now those fines are manageable. The stock is up some 2.5%, Dave.
Okay, yeah, so two fines, and perhaps the market takeaway there is things are going to be fine after this specific one. Just to recap some of the big news, of course, that were the big market themes this Monday. So you have two elections and then the tech rally that Yvonne just laid out for us at about the open. So Japan is doing its own thing, massive move there. We're watching markets in Thailand as well, given, of course, elections there, where you have the Prime Minister claiming victory in the country's general elections. The win for his ruling party may provide a boost for the country's market and also the currency. The SET index has outperformed in Southeast Asia year to date. I think we're up 24% since the bottom of last year specifically. And as you can see, Southeast Asia has had some issues, specifically the Philippines, of course, and the issues for that market late last year. And we've talked about Indonesia at length recently, given, of course, the challenges there. Broader context specifically on Thailand and implications moving forward. Let's get it over to Bangkok now. And our co-anchor, Haslinda Amin, is there for us on the ground. Has.
Well, Dave, what a night, what a win, what a surprise. With 90% of the votes counted, we have Bumjai Thai Party, of course, led by Anutin, set to garner 191 seats. That's triple the number of seats they garnered in the last election. A surprise, a huge surprise. And here's why. The messaging resonated with the people who are pretty much feeling the pinch from the high cost of living. They promised subsidies, cash handouts. They promised jobs in the rural areas. They promised big investments in infrastructure, in tourism, sectors which are key to the economy here in Thailand. What will that mean to all investors? Will it bring back foreign money into the country? That's a big question. And here to talk all about it, the SET President Asadej Kongsiri joins me this morning. Good Asadej, good to have you with us.
Hello, Kap.
What do you make of this big surprise from this election?
Well, I look at it positively because ultimately we're looking for stability and continuity in how our countries run, and hopefully this result will at least make it easier to form a government and make it a stronger and more stable government as well. Because ultimately what we're looking for is continuity. The consistent comment that I've had from international investors in the past about Thailand is that we've got so much potential, and all the policies that have been announced by prior governments has always been great, but when's the execution? So ultimately, if stability comes along and execution can happen, we're looking at it positively.
Can the new coalition fundamentally, materially change the sentiment among foreign investors? We talk about stability, but we're also looking for structural change that would boost the economy, currently growing at the slowest pace in Southeast Asia.
Correct, because fundamentally that's the bottom line, right? How can we grow? How can we reach our potential? I think, at least from the economic team of the Bumjai Thai Party, over the past 4 or 5 months, they've shown a good balance between short-term stimulus and as well as looking at for the long-term structural changes that are required. I think both the Commerce Ministry and the Finance Ministry have done a great job in terms of coordinating themselves and looking to build a stronger platform for the Thai economy in the future.
What kind of flows are you seeing right now? I mean, some say that perhaps the results have been priced in, not fully, but priced in, that stability will come back to the country. What kind of flows are you seeing, especially from the international community?
Well, gladly to say that since the end of December and through January, we've seen positive inflows from international investors.
Can you quantify that?
It's around, the Thai number is around 10 billion baht, so probably about 3 billion or 10 billion baht, let's say. You can exchange rate later, because the exchange rate is another issue we could talk about as well. But it's been a positive flow, so it's been a push on the market. It's encouraged retail investors to also participate more, at least in January.
What is the SCT doing to encourage more investments in the country, a bigger play in the stock exchange here?
Yeah. So it comes down, as I mentioned, fundamentals. How do we push growth in earnings, growth in returns on equity? So one of the big major programs that we launched mid last year is called Jump Plus. So effectively the same as Value Up program in Japan and Korea. Similar, but adjusted for the Thai context. We've got 114 companies signed up already. So we're hoping the growth plans under this program will slowly be disseminated, communicated to investor community over the next 2-3 quarters. We still have room for people to join. We're looking for the larger companies to join the program as well. And hopefully...
Are there goals?
They will have set goals. So effectively, they need to formulate a 3-year plan, investment plan, and what they look to achieve out of those investment plans in terms of real measurable numbers, whether it's be ROE or increases in bottom line and so on. And this will be communicated to investors as well. And we'll be keeping track of it. We'll be communicating. I think they're required to communicate progress every quarter. So we'll see. Hopefully a stronger, more stable government will encourage more people to join the program and more, at least, be brave in terms of investing.
Asadej, I want to take a look at the IPO market. It wasn't that long ago that Thailand was actually a front runner. It's now a laggard. What's the outlook for the IPOs in 2026? It's
relatively stable compared to last year, so it's still relatively down from the pipeline that we've seen at the moment. And for natural reasons, right? PEs are low. The uncertainties both in Thailand and outside of Thailand causes people to at least stop and think about investments and the funds that they want to raise to invest. So things are looking up with this result in the election, with the number of people joining the Jump Up program. I think general sentiment will be better and will ultimately help the IPO process or IPO. How many IPOs? How big might these IPOs be? Is there a target by the end of 2026? We don't actually have a quantitative target. Ultimately, it's been a balancing act in Thailand over the last 3-4 years between quantity and quality. At least from our perspective, we focus on quality. The numbers are up and floating around at the moment. It's tough to say. People are hesitant. People have delayed their processes since the end of last year. So we'll have to regroup and see what the real numbers will be this year. How tough is the sell? Valuations are so low, and a lot of the IPOs that have taken place in Thailand, the stocks have barely done better than their debut. I mean, what concerns are you hearing from potential companies wanting to IPO in the country? Well, unfortunately, the last quarter of 2025, many of the IPOs were the smaller IPOs that have been in place. So we're looking at structurally how those IPOs are distributed. I think the majority of the smaller IPOs, obviously the institutional investors, especially international ones, are not in there. It's just too small for them. So when it's disseminated majority to retail investors, the sentiment can be triggered quite quickly. So we're talking to the investment bankers and the SEC in terms of structurally how can we reallocate or allow a bit more flexibility in terms of allocation to ensure that there's a stronger and more long-term investor base at the IPOs.
How are you positioning Thailand in the context of Southeast Asia? Malaysia, for instance, has become quite an attractive market for IPOs.
Well, I think we're going to be doing a lot of roadshows this year. So with this government, or hopefully the government that's coming along, led by Pongsudhirak, ever since last year already, we've been on roadshows, a couple of roadshows with them, and they're positive for the capital market. They're supportive of the capital market. There were programs in place that unfortunately wasn't launched because of the dissolution of Parliament. So, for example, for the TISA, the Individual Savings Account program, if Pongsudhirak comes back in and leads the economic team, hopefully these programs will be launched very quickly. And then we'll have a story to go to the market and sell to people.
And then you'll come back for an interview with us. Asadej, you alluded to monetary policy, which is, you said, a story on its own. What do you see the Bank of Thailand do it? What does it need to do to help support the economy?
I think from what we've heard of the current governor of the Bank of Thailand, they're looking to have a bigger role. So it's not just interest rates anymore. They need to be part of helping the economy grow. And that's a positive or a nice shift in perspective that we hear. And I'll actually be having lunch with our team. We'll be having lunch with their team shortly later this month, to discuss where we can help each other, encourage and help the economy grow at a faster pace as well.
It is interesting to see how strong the Thai baht has been despite growth being lackluster. Is that a concern because that impinges on exports of the country?
What we've heard, at least from my perspective, what we've heard from the international brokers who obviously speak to their international clients is that's been a bit of a sort of a ceiling, a limitation. So there are concerns that if they come back into the Thai market and the Thai baht weakens, it could be it's seen as a risk, to be honest. The other perspective that we look at it is from our listed companies. Obviously, Thailand is quite dependent on exports, so I wouldn't call it unnaturally or possibly unnatural strength of the Thai baht does have an impact on performances of many of our companies listed.
And of course, Thailand relies a lot on the U.S. market.
Yes.
It has been imposed with 19% tariffs. I'm just wondering, how closely are you watching the change, the transition of the top man at the Fed? How sensitive is Thailand to that?
It has an impact around the world, obviously, where the U.S. policies go along. I think Thailand, as a relatively small economy, is probably less impacted. It will obviously have issues on fund flows, an impact on fund flows. But you mentioned tariffs. I think that's the bigger issue of concern, at least from a local perspective. If we can get the reciprocal tariffs clarified, it will give us or put us in quite a strong position to know where to invest and compete with the rest of the world.
Asadej, always good to have you with us. That was Asadej Kongsiri, President of the Stock Exchange of Thailand, expressing optimism that perhaps foreign investors will now make a U-turn and start investing in the country. Yvonne, back to you.
That was a great interview there, and of course our thanks to the Stock Exchange of Thailand president there for that insightful conversation. And we have more on the Thai election coming up. We get further insights into possible coalition partnerships and their implications with Chulalongkorn University. This is Bloomberg.
Right, just a look at broader rally across risk assets today. So there's Japan and there's tech, and obviously the combination between the two. Hang Seng Tech coming up, bottom of your screens, coming out of the bear market early, but we're also coming off highs fairly quickly on the Hang Seng Tech gauge. There we go.
Yeah, certainly that's going to be a key thing to watch, how long-lasting these moves are going to be now that we have seen a bit of a recovery underway here, maybe some more stability as well. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the news coming out of China as well. The central bank has extended its gold buying streak to 15 months, even as bullion's record-breaking rally was curbed last month by a sharp sell-off. Now, data showing the PBOC's holdings rose last month by 40,000 troy ounces. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has blamed Chinese traders for last week's wild swings in the gold market.
The gold move, things have gotten a little unruly in China. They're having to tighten margin requirements. So the gold looks to me kind of like a classical speculative blow-off.
China has tightened controls on cryptocurrencies. Regulators are barring domestic entities from issuing digital tokens overseas and also banning offshore issuance of yuan-linked stablecoins without approval. Authorities say the rules protect monetary sovereignty and stress that cryptocurrencies have no legal status in China. And Chinese regulators have fined video platform Kuaishou $17 million after pornographic content overwhelmed parts of its platform last December. Beijing's internet watchdog says the company failed to stop illegal material in a timely manner. Kuaishou blamed cyber attacks for the breach, apologized publicly, and says it has completed a review of security, risk controls, and internal management.
Right. We're also tracking the Jimmy Lai story today. He is facing sentencing at the high courts in a landmark national security case. And Lai, of course, was found guilty back in December on all charges and could face life in prison. Our China correspondent, Min Lo, is at the courts in West Kowloon for us to give us a sense of what the atmosphere is like, Min, outside there, and what should we expect from the sentencing. That process, of course, we'll find out in a couple of minutes.
Yes, David, there was a sense of a somber mood here as I was walking outside the courthouse this morning. There was a long line of people waiting to enter the courthouse, many of them camping overnight or even over the weekend. Some of them have been here since Friday afternoon, just hours after the announcement of the timing of the sentencing had been released. And security as well had been tighter than usual. We are seeing police presence that is even heavier than the last times I had been here to cover the trial as well as the verdict, and I saw police officers sort of moving reporters away, telling them not to loiter in the sidewalks as they take photos or talk to some of the supporters here. So very tight security presence here, a lot of attention on this case because, of course, Jimmy Lai has been one of the most infamous sort of democracy activists that is being charged under the national security law. He's now convicted of one count of publishing seditious material under a colonial era law that carries a maximum sentence of 2 years. But he also is convicted of 2 counts of collusion under the national security law, and those have a maximum sentence of life in prison, and even the minimum sentence for a grave offense would be about 10 years in prison. And bear in mind, this is a man who is 78 years old, so even a 20-30-year sentence would potentially be life in prison for him. And we know that his daughter Claire has been lobbying U.S. lawmakers, calling for his release. His lawyers as well at the mitigation hearing last month had been calling for a lighter sentence, citing his ill age and old health. His daughter says he suffers from heart palpitation, from high blood pressure. He has lost weight as well. And we'll see how the judges hand down the ruling later, the sentence later.
And Min, what sort of international reaction do we expect here from governments or even rights groups?
Yes, this is seen as really a test of just how far the reach is for the national security law, and there's been a lot of international attention. President Trump has been a key figure in calling for the release of Jimmy Lai. He raised this with President Xi when he met him in South Korea last year, and we know this is an ongoing conversation according to the U.S. Ambassador David Perdue. So we will be closely watching how those talks progress, especially as President Trump is set to visit Beijing in April, whether there would be some form of mitigation coming from the Chinese government by that time. That's something to closely watch. Of course, other leaders, the UK Prime Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister has also been calling for his release as well.
All right, Min, thank you, Min Lo, there, as we await, of course, this sentencing there at the top court. And coming up, we're going to talk a little more about Thailand, the election outcomes, and we're speaking with Chulalongkorn University's Thitinan Pongsudhirak on the policy's outlook. And this will be, of course, at the times on your screen. This is Bloomberg.
Right, so, we're seeing a big tech bounce across some of the big names here in Hong Kong. As you can see, 2% to the upside. A lot of this also has to do with the fact that the tailwinds coming through out of that NVIDIA bounce on Friday. And that's playing out across Asian chip makers are concerned, showing up on your screens very, very shortly. Chinese chip as well. Chinese chips, there we go, on your screens. Right, the benchmarks coming up on your screens as well. We are coming off the bear market terrain, pulling back from that brink on the Hang Seng Tech Index, although we're coming off highs of the day. Japan is, of course, in focus. Massive move in the equity markets there.
Yep, and of course, if you are a Bloomberg subscriber, make sure to tune into our live Q&A that's happening right now on, of course, Japan and Takaichi's election victory. What does it mean for the country? What does it mean for global markets? Our very own Asia Trade co-anchor Sherry An is hosting right now. Terminal clients and digital subscribers are invited to sign in and ask our team plenty of questions. Well, about more on the next hour. You're watching The China Show. Welcome back to The China Show. Here's a look at the HSI half hour into the session. Happy Monday, guys. It looks like things are looking a little bit better in terms of risk here this morning. We're back above key levels here when it comes to gold prices, back above 5,000. HS Tech is catching a bid here after falling into a bear market last week here, and the Hang Seng is getting closer to that 27,000 level. So has the dust settled? Not quite sure yet after that fresh bout of volatility that really gripped markets and tech last week. We're still kind of licking our wounds in some ways as well. So, but then again, there are some tailwinds, right? Especially what you're seeing in Japan. You have Thailand as well, and you're seeing at least those governments showing signs of stability.
Yeah, and no big surprise as far as some of the tail risks on those elections are concerned. I think it was a known anyway as far as Japan is concerned. I think the landslide to which he was able to deliver that victory really showing up in markets today quite substantially. And it's very hard to also distill the reaction in Japan from the broader tech rally, right? So I think when you look at the Nikkei, for example, I think it's Advantest, which is a tech play and, of course, a Japan play, leading the gains there. On top of that, Thailand, of course, we'll get to that market, of course, later on, top of the next hour. And, yeah, like this massive meltdown in markets, which I missed on Thursday, quickly reversed on Friday. It's as if I woke up and I was looking at...
Why does this keep happening? Every time you take a holiday, something massive happens to markets, I have to say. I think you're the curse or something. I don't know. Don't let David take a break, basically.
It's a leading indicator, actually. Every time I book a ticket, it's probably a good leading indicator.
At least here on the China Show, when I'm left kind of alone. But yes, no, in terms of market check, yes, there seems to be some sort of at least optimism around, not just Japan, but really you're starting to see even the ones that are very, sensitive to the whole global AI trade, like Korea, like Taiwan, that are recovering. Look at the Kospi. We're up some 4% here right now. U.S. futures are also punching a bit higher this morning here. But what else do you have on your radar there?
Apart from that, what's interesting is, I think on the AI story, right, it's the way that markets have shifted their stance on big capex numbers. They used to...
used to be positive.
Genuflect in the presence of a massive capex number, and I think what we're seeing is completely the opposite, and markets reacting quite negatively to. But what's interesting too is what would that mean for the AI infrastructure plays in the Asia Pacific that are tied to the U.S. story as that rotation gains steam? Because we're not seeing that so far as the Korean markets are concerned, right? We're up 4% there, but some of the things I think we'll track going into our conversation shortly with Tim Mo. But just to also mention that, obviously the top stories in Japan, and how do we, as far as sector groups are concerned, right? Japanese banks are underperforming, and is that a reflection of markets anticipating the BOJ not being able to hike interest rates as much, given the sort of pro-fiscal stimulus plans that now Takaichi might be able to introduce to the economy, which, net is going to be good for the economy anyway. It's where the push is going to come from.
Yeah, and I think what surprises me, I'm not surprised that stocks are reacting this way. I'm surprised what's going on with dollar yen. I think there was so much concern if it was this direct majority of the LDP, which we saw, right? Landslide, 2/3 majority. And Japanese yen is still trading around 156 levels. Some say we were going to see it catapult to 160, and then the whole intervention risk sort of story comes back. We're not quite seeing that here today. Mark Cudmore did say, look at more of the pairs than really just dollar yen to trade itself. That is one thing to watch. But you are seeing, in terms of JGB yields, are ticking higher here, potentially on maybe, whether the BOJ, that's certainly going to be one question, but really about the fiscal sustainability sort of concerns too as well. So the Japanese 10-year yield is up some 4 basis points. The 30-year yield, though, is actually heading lower this morning. Joining us now from Singapore is Goldman Sachs' Chief APAC Regional Equity Strategist, Tim Mo. Tim, it's always great to have you. Let's start on Japan. This Takaichi trade, how much longer can it go?
Well, history would suggest it still can go farther. So our Japanese economists and strategists have fresh research out overnight on this. And I think really the key point from an equity market perspective is that this is, number one, a resounding supermajority for the LDP. And if you compare that with previous significant election results, which is when the LDP won 62% in 2005 and 61% in 2012. Those are Koizumi and Abe elections, respectively. This one, to contextualize it, is 68% for Takaichi, so it's really an outstanding result. If you look at market performance, as Bruce Kirk, our Japan strategist, has noted in his piece this morning, that topic was up 60 days after those respective results, was up 23% in 2005 and 31% in 2012. Now, there were some slightly different market conditions then. The starting level valuation levels were lower, so you can't just automatically map those results onto the current situation. But it certainly suggests that, from an historical standpoint, that the market can do better. And I think under the surface, areas that we like, I think, have received further support, and that would be in particular areas around national security and economic security. That would be defense, critical resources, shipbuilding, power resources, and then some of the small and mid caps, which should be beneficiaries of some of Takaichi's plans. So, market's obviously trading that well, but we think there's still further to go.
Right, and from an earnings perspective, as far as the domestic economy is concerned, Tim, is that of relevance to Goldman Sachs now?
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, markets are driven by earnings and valuation change. Valuations coming into this are at the high end of the range. So if we're going to, we need to be arguing for higher kind of range of valuations compared to what we've been in for the past, say, decade or 2 decades. Put numbers on that. We're trading roughly at 16 and a half times forward earnings right now. And that's really up at the top end of where we were during the Abe and Koizumi booms that we saw. So earnings, we've actually raised slightly our numbers about 3 weeks or so ago when we ranged our topics target from 3,600 to 3,900. We're looking at about 11% earnings growth for this year and next, and that was factoring in a somewhat weaker yen. Yvonne was mentioning that in her previous comments that the yen could weaken on the back of this, even though today it's actually slightly strengthened a little bit. We think that the risk around this, in terms of the key asset classes, would be equity stronger, bond yield somewhat higher, i.e. bond prices lower, and then currency lower. I think that's kind of what the market is grappling with right now. From an earnings perspective, when the yen is weaker, that gives you a bit of a tailwind to earnings. The rough metric that we use is about every 10-point move in U.S. dollar Japanese yen on a 1-year average basis maps onto about 4% better earnings growth. So with the yen having weakened somewhat this year, if it stays in that sort of range, then that gave us the 2 or 3% uplift that we factored into our numbers previously. So I think to have better earnings from here, we'd need to see either stronger underlying nominal growth and or policy support, which would drive some of the sectors which I previously mentioned, particularly around national security and economic security. We need to see that come through in order to raise earnings meaningfully from here.
Tim, you said the yen impact could actually be positive for equities. What about when it comes to this melt up in JGBs? We haven't seen quite an impact yet, but at what point do higher JGB yields weigh on the equity market, especially given that Japan is not really immune to this angst that we're seeing around the whole AI's CapEx build out here and how it actually impacts the supply chain?
Right. I think let's just sort of separate those. So I do think we need to be aware that the bond market and the currency markets are likely to be, you might call them sort of homeostatic equilibrating forces. So if the equity market is really pricing in very strong fiscal stimulus, which would then result in better earnings and better growth, which might result in higher valuations. The dampening force on that would be the bond market saying, hang on, we don't have as much fiscal space to allow that, and that might get priced in. And if there's any perhaps a moderation of significant rises in yields, perhaps by some intervention, then I think the currency would be the release valve, which would take that. And then if there's further weakening in the currency, then that could also flow back into how the BOJ might act and might add upside risk to the two hikes that we're expecting this year. We might be able to get perhaps three. So I think there's this kind of feedback mechanism between those three key asset classes, as I was mentioning, and that might be somewhat of a dampener on either how much latitude Prime Minister Takaichi would have in terms of fiscal stimulus, or it might be something that would restrain the equity market valuation if we saw significant moves in the bond and the FX market. So I think that's sort of the path that we have to navigate. But I want to be clear that I think that this result certainly is equity market constructive.
Okay, we'll have more with Tim Mo in a moment there. Just a broader conversation. Really what happened last week, that massive fracturing in the markets and then sort of the healing that took place over the weekend. Tim Mo will be rejoining us in a couple of minutes. And breaking news coming through here out of Hong Kong. Jimmy Lai getting a 20-year prison sentence in the security case. Let's bring in Min Lo, who's standing by for us at the courts. Our China correspondent is with us right now. Min, what can you tell us?
Yeah, it was a very swift proceeding lasting less than 10 minutes. The judge, Esther Toh, coming in, asking everyone to observe the decorum of the courtroom. Anyone who disrupts the proceedings will be asked to leave. And she said that the entire sentencing is about 47 pages long. The document will be uploaded to the judicial website in about 20 minutes from now. She read out some of the key conclusions, and Jimmy Lai has been sentenced to 20 years in prison in total, of which 18 years would be served consecutively. And this is, of course, for the 3 counts that he had been charged with. 1 count of publishing seditious material, which is under a colonial era law, and he had also been found guilty of 2 counts of collusion with foreign forces under the national security law. So a total of 20 years in prison. But again, for a man who is now 78 years old, 20 years could be possibly equivalent to life in prison for him.
And Min, just tell us a bit more about the implications of all this in this case now. Obviously, when it comes to a lot of questions about, how are they going to, in some ways, look at these cases once again when it comes to collusion, when it comes to sedition? What are the implications, you think?
Well, obviously, this is a high-profile case that is sending a warning message in some ways as well to the rest of Hong Kong citizens here in Hong Kong that China will not tolerate any form of subversion, right? But it's interesting because the potential sentence could have been up to life in prison. So Jimmy Lai didn't get the maximum sentence that he could have gotten. But again, considering his old age, 20 years is not a light sentence as well. And the implications here, of course, we had already seen a lot of changes in the city, the dismantling of civil society organizations, activists seizing some of their activities, many former opposition lawmakers that has been arrested, and Jimmy Lai now, of course, one of the most well-known cases that has gotten a lot of international attention. I think what we want to look ahead to is whether or not the international community will be successful in lobbying the Chinese government to perhaps lighten his sentence even further down the road, right? We know President Trump is going to visit Beijing in April and meet with President Xi. David Perdue, the U.S. ambassador, had said that this is an ongoing conversation with China. They have been trying to secure the release of Jimmy Lai. Whether or not all that lobbying will be successful is something that we'll keep looking out for.
Min, thank you. Min Lo there with the latest when it comes to the sentencing. Again, Jimmy Lai getting 20-year prison sentence in this national security case. Well, plenty more coming out. This is Bloomberg.
Right, market reaction, initial take this week. Of course, you have elections in Japan, plus everything else that's been going well for for Korea, 4.5% on the Kospi index. Still with us is Tim Mo, Chief APAC Regional Equity Strategist at Goldman Sachs. Tim, how do you look at a market like Korea, against the backdrop of this, I guess, rotation out of the big AI winners in the U.S., a market that's effectively more than doubled in price? How do you play Korea? And why do you think it's happening?
Okay, so there's a lot in those questions there, David. A few things. One, just to be clear, we've been positive in Korea and remain so. We're overweight. It's one of our top markets. And I think really the narrative here is that not the whole story for Korea, but obviously a significant part of it is this memory supercycle that we're in, which has very positive effects on 40% of the index, which of course is Samsung and Hynix. There are other aspects to Korea as well: defense theme, construction, biotech, shipbuilding, a variety of other themes, as well as value up, which we can talk about. But clearly what's driving the significant change in earnings expectations is the memory cycle. Our semiconductor analysts have just published an update on their global expectations and outlook for DRAM and NAND. And the key point here to understand is that we have a record supply shortfall globally in both DRAM and NAND, and that's if you go back, 15 or more years in sort of the modern cycle. This is the steepest shortfall that we've seen, and the important point here is to connect that with the operating fundamentals of the semiconductor industry, which are that it's got the highest operating leverage of pretty much any industry, given the high ticket size of each incremental fab. And what that means is that when you've got that supply shortfall, you've got very significant pricing power, and that pricing power falls to the bottom line in a magnified way. Consensus earnings for Korea have gone from about 25-30% maybe 6 months ago for 2026, 25-30% growth, to now over 100% growth. And we've correspondingly raised our numbers as well. What that means is that even though the market this year is up over 20%, 25% as of today's plus 4% move, the forward multiple for the market has actually gone down. And as of Friday's close, we're trading at 8.3 times forward earnings. If you include today, sort of 8.7 maybe. And these are very reasonable numbers in absolute terms and relative to the market's historical trading range. So since we think that this will be an extended cycle, not your garden variety one, but one that lasts longer and is stronger for a variety of reasons, but really around the deployment and the compute power required for diffusing AI out into the broader economy, coupled with the fact that it's hard to have an immediate supply response in terms of building advanced fabs, and some other technical aspects having to do with rising proportion of high bandwidth memory compared to total memory. That sets us up for a cycle which we think will extend longer than your typical one, and that suggests that the Korean market can actually do well as well. And then the final thing I'll just mention is to add on top of that, number one, that foreign positioning is still fairly conservative. In fact, foreigners up until last week had actually slightly net sold Korea this year. And number two, we still have all the positive corporate governance advances that are taking place, which can argue for an increase in the overall valuation of the market beyond what its historical trading range has been. In other words, closing that historical Korean valuation discount to the rest of the region. So we think that the ingredients of earnings growth, modest valuations, light foreign positioning, and additional Korea-specific catalysts still argue for a constructive view in the market, which we have.
Okay, we get that. And really, in some ways, markets like Korea and Taiwan should be actually benefiting from, when I hear a hyperscaler in the U.S. talk about hundreds of billions of dollars of AI capex buildup. But that's not the case right now, Tim. It seems like they're just equally vulnerable to what happens with U.S. tech sell-offs and really global, the narrative, right? I'm just wondering, how vulnerable do you think these markets are to what happens in the U.S.?
Yvonne, it's a terrific question, and it is the central one. And the answer is, from a sentiment standpoint, of course, as we saw late last week, they're vulnerable. And anytime a market goes up, 100% last year, or was up 90% in dollar terms for MSCI Korea last year, and up another 20, 25% this year, you're going to get spiky pullbacks. I mean, we saw a 10% correction in the market early in the fourth quarter last year, and a number of people got shaken out of the market at that point. And since then, we're up another 30 plus percent from that level. So you're going to get these kind of pullbacks. The key point I'd make is that as long as that hyperscaler spending persists, which we think is clearly the case for this year and well into 2027, even though the U.S. market may be getting concerned about the return on equity for the hyperscalers, return on that investment, which is why not all the increases that have been announced in CapEx by the likes of Microsoft and Google and so forth are being met with share price gains. As long as that spending persists, it's still very positive fundamentally for the upstream providers into that, which would be particularly the North Asian, Korean, and Taiwan semiconductor manufacturers, and obviously, of course, TMC and fabs in Taiwan. So maybe the slightly realpolitik or maybe pragmatic view here is that in the longer run, it could prove. I'm not saying this is a forecast, but it could be that all this spending comes to naught in terms of not having sufficient return on it to justify the expenditure that the U.S. hyperscalers are making. But in the meantime, it's very, very bullish for the upstream semiconductor manufacturers. And as long as that spending continues into 2027 and arguably into 2028, I think in the first quarter of 2026, it's too early to sell the Asian suppliers into that. That would really be our pragmatic take.
Tim, just a final thought on what we spoke with Kinger, of course, your colleague last week, but just your thoughts on when do you think this Chinese tech market reverses higher, and what do you think is behind the recent weakness?
I think that some of the weakness relates to the spillover from concerns in semiconductors. In terms of software in the U.S. Because the narrative on China is basically it's that the China AI play is more software oriented. The ecosystems, for example, of Alibaba and Tencent. Then there's the so-called physical AI aspect, which is imbuing robotics, AI things, and so forth with artificial intelligence. But the strongest fundamental aspects that we've just been saying has been the so-called hard tech, which has been the semiconductor areas. So I think that what can partially explain what's been going on in China is that you've had concerns about the introduction of Claude Code and other advanced programs, which have raised concerns over software related longer-term earning streams. And I think that's been mapped onto the pricing action in China. In some cases, I think inappropriately so, because the ecosystems that Alibaba and Tencent have are not just purely driven by selling software. It's really by being able to monetize through application of AI a larger ecosystem of services and products that I think will not be as easily disrupted as maybe the pure software players. The risk on that is in the U.S. So bottom line here is that we think that sell-off has been overdone. We think these are very high-quality companies. We think they can regain upward traction. And as Kinger has mentioned on previous shows, and as I'll reiterate now, we're overweight on China, both A and H, and think that this is actually a pretty good entry point.
Tim, great to have you as always. Tim Mo there, Chief APAC Regional Equity Strategist at Goldman Sachs, joining us out of Singapore. We'll bring you back to those live pictures out in Hong Kong. After just moments ago, we did get that sentencing of Jimmy Lai, the media mogul, getting a 20-year prison sentence. This is the heaviest penalty ever under this Beijing-imposed national security law. As you can see, a pretty crowded and rowdy sort of crowd outside here right now. We're going to get John Burns from the University of Hong Kong to tell us a little bit more about what this all means moving forward. This is Bloomberg.
Right. Two stocks we're tracking here. KDDI over in Japan plunging by the most in almost 6 years. This fictitious fake sales accounts and so probes into that sinking. The shares were down about 8%. Their SoftBank's going, I believe, the opposite way, up as much as 8.5%. That's the most, get this, in just several days. Just give you an indication really of how good things have been there for SoftBank. Broadly speaking, it's a chip rally story. It's a tech rally story. It's an election-related story. You put everything together, we're up 4 or 5% on Nikkei going into the lunch break.
It's 11:29 a.m. in Tokyo. Japanese markets are heading to that lunch break in just a moment. And yeah, what a day, really, on the back of that landslide victory for Prime Minister Asadej Takaichi with that historic election win here and really positioning her as a nation's strongest leader in the post-war era. Japanese stocks are certainly liking that. We're up about 4.5% here. The Topics is also up 2%. Dollar yen, actually have seen a bit of strength when it comes to yen. Most were expecting things to weaken further, but we're at 156, 157 levels right now. Perhaps that has been priced in. But yes, JGB yields, though, are still ticking slightly higher by 4 basis points for your Japanese 10-year yield.
Yeah, I think Mark Cudmore had a very good comment earlier on, right? Like, why isn't the yen at dollar yen specifically at 160? And he said, you look at the pairs instead of this specific metric as a gauge, I guess, of where the yen should be weakening toward at this point in time. And I think when you look at it from a reflationary perspective, why are Japanese assets reflating today, whether that's this melt up in yields, which have been melting up, this obviously repricing of a known in Japan, which is the equity market. It certainly does point to a stronger mandate that the market is adjusting to this Monday morning. The other big news, of course, in the last few minutes or so, Jimmy Lai getting a 20-year prison sentence here in Hong Kong. Fairly lively scenes outside the courthouse a few minutes back, which we showed you. In fact, Min Lo, our China correspondent, is there with us on the ground at the court in West Kowloon to give us just more context in terms of reaction, what the mood is like post this announcement, Min.
Yes, post the announcement, we just saw the wife of Jimmy Lai, Teresa, walking out of the courthouse along with Cardinal Joseph Zen. And when they walked out, a bunch of journalists and cameramen rushed forward, trying to interview them. And the police immediately sort of intervened, just crowded around them, escorting them. And a big crowd of police putting their hands on each other's shoulders to sort of blockade them. I was following the scrum all the way until the end of the road. And then we were not allowed to stand on the road, so we were pretty much prevented from talking to them. So a big crowd of people, the police was on loudspeaker, constantly repeating the message, please move forward, do not linger. So clearly a very heavy security presence here to, I guess, protect the people that were coming out of the courtroom and prevent journalists from getting too close or asking too many questions. And of course, it's a somber day for many of these supporters who queued and camped over the weekend since last Friday outside this courthouse, trying to go inside to witness the proceeding today. It was an extremely quick affair, just about less than 15 minutes, and the proceeding was over. Jimmy Lai got those 20 years in prison for colluding with foreign forces, 2 counts of that, and publishing seditious material, 1 count of that. That is under a colonial era law. 18 of those years will be served in tandem. And he is now 78 years old, so 20 years later he would be 98. It's pretty much potentially going to be life in prison for a man of that age.
Min, thank you. Min Lo there giving us the latest from West Kowloon. As she mentioned there, quite a busy scene there after, of course, this sentencing. For more, of course, with this, let's bring in John Burns, Emeritus Professor and Honorary Professor at the University of Hong Kong. John, your reaction after you're hearing this 20-year sentence for Jimmy Lai?
Not a surprise at all. I mean, I expected him to get something like that, 15 to 20 years. It could have been longer, of course, but for a person his age, a 20-year sentence is effectively a life sentence. I mean, he'll be 98 by the time the sentence is up. He will not get remission for good behavior or anything like that. So not a surprise.
The message you think it sends, as far as from the legal perspective is concerned, and also could be a separate question, to the business community?
Yes, so the message, I think, is that national security is being taken very seriously by China and by the Hong Kong government and the Hong Kong judiciary. And so the other thing is, if we look at the Jimmy Lai case, relatively few people have been charged with this crime of going to Western politicians and encouraging them to interfere in Hong Kong or China or sanction our leaders or things like that. Very few. And so it is not the big significant case, I would say, for national security. We've seen much more significant cases, such as those that have Stand News, that focused on the media, or those that have focused on a much larger group of political opponents, such as the 47 primary election case. These are much more significant. They were the ones that established the red lines about sedition, subversion, and these are the kinds of crimes that the authorities have gone after, especially in Hong Kong.
What sort of international reaction are we expecting? We've heard from President Trump, we've heard from Keir Starmer from the UK that has urged at least some leniency, or at least to release Jimmy Lai. To what extent do you think this case could heighten tensions with some Western nations out there?
So I think international reaction, we have to consider what are the priorities when governments are dealing with China. And Jimmy Lai is not the priority. I mean, the priorities are things like access to rare earth, trade, for the United States, a free hand in the Americas, Ukraine, Iran, the Middle East. These are even nuclear weapons, these are the big issues, not Jimmy Lai. So while Western politicians may say something, I mean, Starmer, you mentioned him. He's just returned from China, and maybe he mentioned this, I don't know, but China also knows that the big issue, the big hot-button issues for Western countries are not Jimmy Lai.
What does it mean for businesses looking, asking the question, and answer the question if you could, in what way has Hong Kong changed?
So Hong Kong has changed, and business cares about that. Business wants predictability, they want stability, they want high-quality regulation. The Jimmy Lai case doesn't impact on that. They want investment, and so these are important things. However, Hong Kong has changed with the imposition of the national security law. It has damaged our rule of law. It has reduced the relative independence or autonomy of the judiciary. Still, our judiciary is more autonomous or independent than, say, the executive or the legislature in Hong Kong, which the authorities, I would say, have tighter control of. But they did influence the judiciary's ability to hold jury trials, or to grant bail, or the prison system to give remission, and choose counsel, all of these kind of things. And I would say in that sense they damaged the rule of law. The question really is, how much is this damage in the national security area going to wash over into other parts of our legal system that business cares about, especially, such as contracts and commercial disputes? My own view is that eventually it will, but I don't think it's happened yet. So the question is, when?
Yes, I mean, tell us a bit more about that. I mean, at what point do you think that, give us maybe more examples of what you think this could actually be applied to other parts of business, right?
Well, for example, if the central government, as they have done, have said that you may not sue a state-owned enterprise in a Hong Kong court because that's suing the state or something like this, I understand they have said something like this already. So this is could be framed as a national security issue. I mean, let's face it, China has imposed a very broad understanding of national security, 20 different kinds of national security, food security, political security, economic security, finance security, polar security, all these different things. And so so much of public policy, so much of the things that businesses and other people care about could be affected by this.
John. Pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. John Burns there, Professor Emeritus and Honorary Professor at the University of Hong Kong. Right. In other world news that we're tracking this morning, let's get an update on Iran. And the president there says nuclear talks with Washington on Friday were a step forward. Now, the talks mediated by Oman included the foreign minister as well as the U.S. special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and, of course, Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law. Now, Trump characterized the negotiations as very good and says another meeting is set for early next week. Now, the political future of UK Prime Minister, that's Keir Starmer, is in the balance on the appointment of Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the U.S. And it's after revelations, of course, over Mandelson's past ties with Jeffrey Epstein. Starmer's chief of staff, Morgan McSweeney, has quit, saying he takes full responsibility for advising Starmer to make the appointment. It leaves the Prime Minister increasingly exposed as calls grow for change at the top.
Well, China has tightened curbs when it comes to cryptocurrencies and tokenized real-world assets and banning offshore issuance of yuan-linked stablecoins without approval. Let's get the latest now from our crypto reporter, Subhashri Ghosh. She joins us now from Singapore. So, Subha, tell us what this means for crypto, because there were some who are actually hoping for offshore yuan-pegged stablecoin licenses. What does this all mean now?
Indeed, you're right, Yvonne. They were hoping, and this looks like cold water on those plans, because this is not the first time China has expressed its intention that they don't want anything to do with private yuan-pegged stablecoins, and in a way, this is like doubling down their stance that, we are warning about this, so don't do it. So that's kind of a very clear message that China has sent to anybody who has been kind of, still hopeful that they can come around and China could relax those rules and eventually allow them to issue offshore yuan-based stablecoins. So that kind of, as of now, looks like is pretty much out of the window, and any stablecoin issuer will have to do with any business model that has to be without that plan now.
And does this have any bearing on the stablecoin outlook here in Hong Kong?
That's a very interesting question, actually, David. Yeah, it does. I mean, when we were talking about the Hong Kong stablecoin issuance, the license that the regulation that came into play last August, actually, most of the applicants or potential applicants were telling us, we would love to have this because that will, in a way, allow us to, at some point of time, go into either China or even in Hong Kong, have those offshore yuan-based stablecoins. So they were hopeful that could be a way to issue, Hong Kong could be a way for them to issue offshore yuan-based stablecoins, and eventually as well in China, yuan-pegged stablecoins. So the outlook looks little, grim, because those hopes are, as I said, not really likely to have bear fruits, at least in the near future. And overall, even Hong Kong, after this very stark warning from China, will be treading carefully. I mean, that's what is expected when it comes out with licenses, which is expected in the next few weeks from Hong Kong on its own stablecoin regime.
Yeah, I think I did see a line on that, of course, coming through, I believe, in March, if I'm not mistaken. Watch out for that. Separately, of course. Thank you so much, Subhashri Ghosh, our crypto reporter in Singapore, for us. We will leave you with a look at cash markets for about an hour and 10 or so minutes into the cash market session this Monday, and we have retaken to the upside at 27,000 handle on the Hang Seng Index.
Hopefully this result will at least make it easier to form a government and make it a stronger and more stable government as well. Because ultimately what we're looking for is continuity. The consistent comment that I've had from international investors in the past about Thailand is that we've got so much potential. And all the policies that have been announced by prior governments has always been great, but when's the execution? So ultimately, if stability comes along and execution can happen.
That was the stock exchange president over in Thailand just early on, about an hour back, of course, just talking about what this means for the markets, the election victory for the ruling Conservative Party. In fact, let's get more on what this means more broadly and cross it over now to Bangkok with our colleague, of course, Linda Ahmed, our co-anchor, is there with her next guest who has written about politics in Thailand for decades.
That's right. The man with the answers, hopefully, Dave. With me, Thitinan Pongsudhirak of Chulalongkorn University. Thitinan, good to have you with us. A huge surprise. I mean, the fact that Bumjai Thai Party garnered 3 times the vote of the last election. I mean, what went right for them?
A number of reasons. First, I think this morning a lot of people have woken up to a very kind of counterintuitive outcome. The poll suggested that the People's Party would win. They won in 2023. Bumjai Thai came in third. I think Anutin really leveraged his government when he took office in September. A lot of the base, the young base of People's Party were upset because People's Party voted for Anutin. They didn't have their own candidate. So he took office and then he used that power in office to leverage, to entice the other smaller factions to join his party. So from being a third medium-sized party of 71 MPs, it became a large party. And then he also used the incumbency advantages, having the budget to spend. His party, Bumjai Thai, has a big war chest. They also know how to canvass for votes. If you look at 2024 in the countryside around Thailand, especially in the north and northeast, they know how to get voters to vote for them, canvassing and using the war chest. So a number of factors, the nationalism with Cambodia, the Cambodia border clash in July last year, December last year, people still have that fresh in their minds about the need to protect Thai sovereignty, stand up to Cambodia. He played on that well. He also benefited from royalism, being seen as a kind of the establishment-backed party. And he has his technocrats, in 3 places, finance minister, commerce minister, foreign minister, that have helped him on campaign rallies. And so people look to him for status quo, for some stability.
Right.
And the numbers suggest that very clearly.
So Anutin is a smooth operator. The fact is, can he deliver? That is the big question. If you take a look at his track record of the last 4 or 5 months, what would you say?
I mean, we have to acknowledge 2 things, that he's won the election hands down, very clear. On the other hand, his policy performance as a manager in the cabinet doesn't have a lot to show for. For example, I mean, the vaccines procurement, going back to the COVID, the pandemic, was very slow for Thailand to get mRNA. The cannabis, remember, is in limbo. It's not quite legalized, but it's decriminalized. Anutin was the health minister at that time. And then the scam networks that he's really not tackling fully head on. And then the floods in the south we had recently, he was very slow to act on that. It looked like he was overwhelmed by issues and not really a policy man. But the margin now will enable him to do whatever he wants. He has a strong coalition, strong margin, and we'll see. He has to start talking soon about policies, and he will rely on these technocrats. He also has to keep the vested interests under control, under supervision, because a lot of these factions and provincial patronage networks, they operate on pork, on rent, on rent seeking.
On the surface, it does look like Anutin may just be able to see through his 4-year term. And that's a feat in itself. And that's possibly because of his good relationship with the military as well as the royal family. That's a fair assumption. That's
evident. And in the last 26 years, can you believe that only one elected government in 2001, the Thaksin government, lasted a full term? The rest, won by the Thaksin parties, won by the Move Forward and People's Party, have been derailed and stymied and dissolved ultimately time and again, and punctuated by street protests, by 2 military coups in 2006, 2014. With Anutin in power now, backed by the establishment, we will most likely not have that kind of instability and volatility. So he's got a clear path, very stable, coalition very strong. Now it comes down now to policy performance. If he doesn't do well, people will get fed up. I mean, the economy is being squeezed on all fronts. I mean, Thailand's not so competitive now. It's low growth, debt is high, household debt, public debt. So let's see what he does with that. If he doesn't do well, then pressure will build again, and People's Party will be there to take advantage of it.
Great disappointment for the People's Party. All the polls leading up to the election show that they will win the most number of votes, do better than the previous election. What happened for them?
Well, it's really a counterintuitive kind of surprising outcome, because not just the polls, but the momentum for reform in Thailand. It goes back to the Thaksin era. people have voted for change and progress vis-a-vis the establishment, the conservatives, royalists. But this time they've gone the other way, which is to vote for the status quo, not for change and progress. I think People's Party, they suffered from having supported Thitinan. I think their base was not happy. I think that they could not campaign on the Lèse Majesté amendment because now that's been banned. So they had to stick to kind of a more bland anti-corruption drive. The leadership not as strong as before, not as charismatic. And then they are seen as maybe not nationalistic enough on Cambodia, the Cambodia border clash. So all in all, I think also the turnout was not as high as expected. It was we had 74-75% last two elections before yesterday, but this time less than 70%, maybe 64%. So a number of question marks now for the People's Party to regain their ground.
Thitinan, thank you so much for your assessment today. That was Thitinan Pongsudhirak of Chulalongkorn University, trying to make sense of the results that we've seen from last night's election. Yvonne, handing it back to you.
All right, Haz, thank you so much. Of course, we'll have more from Haz out of Bangkok here during her hour of insight coming up here. And a reminder of our new online feature as well, the Bloomberg Video Hub, where subscribers can explore live streaming, news, and interviews, all our Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporter analysis, and more. You can make sure to check it out at Bloomberg.com/videos. This is Bloomberg.
Okay, in case you missed it, ByteDance 2 days ago launched this video model, CDance 2.0, and some of the names, as you can see, market reaction has been positive, massively, in some cases limit up. Some of the median AI application stocks tied to the broader story, video generation model, in case you're curious what that was, are reacting to that. Analysts are saying it has surprised in terms of the quality of the clips that it was generated. And as you can see, of course, markets are running along those lines, given, of course, that launch that took place, I think, on the weekend.
Yep. And, of course, the next market to watch for us is Thailand as it opens up the next hour. And certainly it's going to be, what this means, right, given the fact that it's a clear Thai election victory. In itself, it gives a bit more of stability, policy continuity here for investors. So this convincing win from the ruling Bunjay Thai party during the Sunday election could really help boost the stock market, which, as you've compared to the rest of Southeast Asia, has been doing, relatively speaking, better. Yeah, they've done very well this year relative to others. They've done well over the past few months or so. So yeah, we will see what that looks like once it opens up in the next hour. That's it from us. They're here on the China show. And, of course, on the ground for us, our co-anchor Haz is there on the ground to unpack those elections on the weekend. We will see you all tomorrow.